I'm Jodie and welcome back to the Jodie Makes podcast. Hi, if you're new around here, my name's Jodie. I'm a knitter and crocheter based in the northwest of England, and I upload a video every other Sunday just talking about my knitting and crochet hobbies. If you enjoy the video today and you want to stick around, I'd love it if you subscribed, and please hit the like button because that really helps the channel out. I wanted to take a bit of time today to chat to you about scrap busting and sort of stash busting. Anyone that's been around for any length of time will know that I'm currently on a stash down this year, and the way that I'm working that is that I've recorded the weight of every single gram in my stash, regardless of whether it is a full sort of multiple 100-gram skein or if it's the most tiny remnant that's been left over from a project. And so when it comes to my stash down, really any piece of yarn that I can get out of stash goes towards that goal. If it's a sweater project that I've cast on using 10-12 skeins of the same sort of yarn, or 10-12 skeins of mixtures of yarn that I've put together, or if it's something as simple as taking something and adding some embellishments or making a tiny accessory. And so that's really got me thinking about how I can use up those tiny little scraps. So I'm starting to get to the point in my knitting journey where quite a bit of my stash is now made up of sort of odds and sods of remnants of things that have been left over from other projects, things that I purchased when I was a newer knitter, when I was less familiar with things like fibre content, and even just the amount of yarn that you needed to complete a certain project. So yeah, I just wanted to do a roundup today. There is going to be some specific patterns, but there's also just going to be sort of some mindset shifts, some sort of concepts that I'd like to go through, because I think when we think about scrap busting and when we think about stash busting, we're tending to look for patterns that specifically call for small amounts of yarn or a certain type of yarn or a certain situation, things that are designed to be scrappy. But I think if you start thinking about scraps in a slightly different way, then that actually opens up a whole host of additional patterns that you can use your scraps for. It starts making things a little bit more exciting, you know. There's only so many scrappy scarves and scrappy socks you can make. Don't get me wrong, there is going to be some of that in this video, but again, it's going to be a bit of a mixture of specific patterns that I've seen that I think, oh, I've got some scraps that might be good for that, or that I might be able to start working on a longer term scrappy project of that ilk. There is also just going to be some concepts where I've thought, this is something that's occurred to me when I'm thinking about how I'm going to use my scraps up, and it might be something that you've not thought about that might help you out. So I thought I'd get the most obvious things out of the way first, and I think when people think about scrap busting, they immediately think of small projects. So when I think of small projects, I'm thinking something that's a single skein or less, so usually 50 to 100 grams absolute max of any single colour. So when we're talking about small projects, the first thing that comes to my mind is baby items. So baby hats, baby socks, baby booties, bibs. If you've got a couple of different colours that are complementary that could work together, you might be able to work it into something like a jumper. I've had so many scenarios where I've had a single 100-gram skein of DK weight yarn and a baby sweater has used up pretty much every single bit of it. It's left like a little tiny bit, but 100-gram skeins is usually enough to get a sweater that's up to sort of like the 6 to 9 month mark, depending on the stitch pattern. And then for anything less, like I say, hats, socks, boots, bibs. And what I really like about this is if you start with the largest project first, you might be able to get sort of a matching set. So say you've got like 70 grams of a DK weight acrylic in your stash, you might be able to get a hat and some booties out of that, and that would be a really nice set to give to somebody that's expecting. Other things that come to mind when I think about small projects for scrap busting is hair scrunchies. And the thing I really like about scrunchies is that these are really sort of, it doesn't matter how much yarn you've got, what weight it is, what colour it is, what fibre it is, you can really adjust that pattern to fit the amount and type of yarn that you've got. And really all you need to think about is how the weight of your yarn and the amount of your yarn might affect the size and the fit of the scrunchie. Another really obvious one, if you've got some fingering weight sock yarn that's left over from some socks that you've made, you might have enough to make heels, toes, cuffs with them. You might not have enough to do heels, toes and cuffs, but you might have enough to do just the toes or just the heels or just the cuffs or just the cuffs and the toe or just the toe and the heel. You don't necessarily need to make those matching, but you can still use up those scraps. And I suppose as long as you've done it the same on each sock, it's going to look intentional. Speaking of contrast accessories, I think the brim of a hat is also a really good way to use up little bits of yarn. If it's not quite enough for a hat, it might be enough for the brim of a hat or for the body of the hat. You know, if you've got 2 remnants of a DK weight yarn, you might not have enough of each of those yarns to make a hat independently, but you might have enough of one to make the body of the hat and enough of the other to make the brim. If you've got really small amounts of yarn, one thing that I thought was really interesting is using that bit of yarn to make an I-cord tie. So either an I-cord tie for like a drawstring bag, or maybe for the cord that you'd put in the hood of a hoodie. Or you could even use it as like a contrast rim on something like a bonnet or something like that. Just like a really small detailing piece, either like an I-cord, or you could make a little I-cord bow and attach that to something, like sew it onto something. Just something really, really small that's made out of an I-cord that's either like a drawstring or something that's functional. Or you could even use it to repair something, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a new project. If you've got a bag that has a drawstring and the drawstring is broke, why not knit an I-cord with some scrappy yarn and use that to replace that, and that would prolong the life of the item for you. Another thing that would work really good for slightly smaller amounts of yarn is things like soft toys, dolls' clothes, dolls' accessories, sort of really small things. And depending on the size of the doll would depend on how much yarn you'd need. You know, if you have like a 45cm average sized baby doll, you might need a little bit more yarn to make a hat or some socks or a cardigan for that. You could even make cardigans for Barbies. And I also think that knitted toys is a really good way to get rid of those really little bits of scraps. So if you think about, if you were making, say, a teddy bear, you might need quite a bit of the colour of yarn that you're using to make like the head and the ears and the body and the arms and the legs, but you might only need a little bit for the embellishments for the face, like the nose and the eyes and the mouth, the inside of the ears, the pads on the arms and legs. Just little details like that. You can really get quite a lot of mileage out of some of your really little scraps doing that. Another one for small amounts is things like covers and cozies. So if you've got sort of a tablet device or even a mobile phone, books, all sorts of things like that, you could do not just covers as well, not just covers and cozies, things like bookmarks, just little accessories for things like that. You could do those like netted crochet bags. Like I've seen a lot of people make little water bottle bags, like netted ones with crochet. They don't seem to take up a lot of yarn. If you've got a few different colours of cotton yarn in your stash that's the same size, you might even be able to sort of stripe those together or amalgamate them to make more. I actually think that when those projects are made out of sort of scrappy materials and they don't necessarily look the best when you first make them, they're all the more functional because you're not worried about ruining them. And then finally, for those like micro bits of scraps, things like household ornaments and Christmas decorations, because they tend to have multiple colours in them, you really don't need much of each different colour. And depending on the colours and the weights of yarn and the amounts of yarn that you've got in your stash, you can make all sorts of things for Christmas trees and just things that sit on windowsills and things like that. So for the small projects, I'm not necessarily going to recommend any specific patterns. Again, I think this is sort of one of those things where if you're into scrapbusting, this is probably the first place you're going to look. And so don't think I'm necessarily offering anything novel to the table by talking about small projects. But if you're just starting out with your scrapbusting, this is sort of some direction, and maybe you just put some of these search terms into Ravelry, say, you know, baby hat, baby booties, soft toys. There's actually a lot of things on Ravelry in terms of the categories. If you go to the items option, you can select things like, I want to make a soft toy, I want to make a doll's cardigan, I want to make something for a baby. You can even put in the amount of yarn that you've got and it will recommend patterns based on that. So I really think when it comes to finding patterns, the small projects idea is probably the one where you're going to find a lot of options yourself. Again, another one that's probably quite obvious, but the second place my mind goes to when I think about using up leftovers and scraps is colour work. And really any technique in terms of colour work is really good, but I think in particular duplicate stitch can really shine here. So I am going to recommend some specific patterns that would be really good for scraps here. And the first one that I'm going to recommend is Kintra by Rebecca Clow. Now, when she first released this was just a sweater pattern, but I think she's now released a scarf, a bag, and maybe a cushion cover. There's definitely 4 different patterns with this Kintra motif on. And Rebecca originally released this with advent calendars in mind. So every single colour in that colourwork motif will use 20 grams of yarn or less. And in the pattern, she does actually break down exactly how much yarn you would need for each stripe of the sweater. So you can get really granular with this. If you know that you've got 5 grams of this and 12 grams of that and 13 grams of this, you can really map out that yoke so that you're getting the maximum bang for your buck with each of those different scraps. You might be able to use them twice and things like that, but you can really do the maths on, have I got enough of this yarn to include it in this sweater, and I love that she breaks it down like that for you to like remove all of the guesswork. I think another one that is probably really popular in this sort of scrappy using up leftover space is the Sea Glass series. Again, there's a bunch of things here. I think there's a sweater, a t-shirt, a hat, I think there's some socks, maybe some mittens. There's plenty, just take your pick. I think there's something for everybody in the Sea Glass range. And again, it's one of these sort of one by one, constantly colour changing colourwork motifs. And I just think it's gorgeous. I don't think I've seen one where I've thought, I don't really like that. I just think that I've never seen something so scrappy look so good so consistently, and so this is definitely on my to make list once I've got enough scraps. And then the final sort of traditional colourwork one that I've got is the Scrappy Scrunchie. Now there's a couple of different patterns on Ravelry that go by Scrappy Scrunchie, and to be honest, they are all sort of par for the course in terms of what you'd expect. There's a slight colourwork motif. They're intended for really small amounts of yarn. I think quite a lot of it is one by one. I'm going to recommend a couple here. But again, like going back to small items and scrunchies, you can put your own colourwork motifs onto some of these sometimes a bit. So then coming back to the duplicate stitch idea, I think the one that really started this trend off, or like duplicate stitch wasn't necessarily particularly popular until the tomato sweater came out. And I think everybody looked at this, and for me, like, duplicate stitches are my favourite. I think I would have preferred this if it was intarsia. However, I do think that duplicate stitch got a time and a place, and I like the idea that you could knit a really plain sweater and you get that enjoyment of that sort of rhythmic meditative stockinette in the round, and then you can turn that simple stockinette sweater into something a little bit more interesting with a duplicate stitch. So like I said, the tomato sweater is one that sort of started this off in my brain. But a couple more examples. I think the outline sweater by Rose Knitwear is another really good example. I think the piping up the sign is done with a crochet chain, so maybe not exactly duplicate stitch, but definitely of that ilk. And one that I've made is the, I think it's called the Triceratop, and it's a children's jumper. Again, stockinette in the round, nice easy raglan, and then there's this really scrappy Triceratops motif where it's made up of little blocks of colours. It's really effective and I really like it. I made it for a friend for her little boy for Christmas last year and they absolutely loved it. And again, it's really good for just like little odds and sods of colours. If you've been knitting for a while, and especially like if you like to make jumpers for children and you've got a go-to yarn that you make children's sweaters out of, and you've got that little sort of like 5-10 grams that you end up with if you've got a 100 gram skein of DK weight yarn and you've made like one of the smaller sizes, you end up with those really small little nuggets. That pattern would be absolutely perfect for those. And then I did also just want to call out on the topic of duplicate stitch, like if you have a stockinette plain like basic sweater in your library that you really like, just knit that and then just think of what you would want on there, and then you can use something like Stitch Fiddle or even Microsoft Excel or any sort of spreadsheet software that you prefer. You can make your own chart on something like that and then superimpose that onto there. You do need to do a little bit of maths if you're wanting to put something quite big on your sweater. You might need to make sure that the gauge of your sweater means that you've got enough stitches on the front, but if you're just making something really small in the middle, in the centre, you might not even need to do that. And that way you've got something really personal to you, and you can even sort of customise it to the amount of scraps that you've got. I think that would be a really good idea. So the next using up your scraps technique I see talked about a little bit is magic knot balls. Now I kind of want to push this concept a little bit further. You can obviously do a standard magic knot ball where maybe you add to that magic knot ball every time you finish a project, and so the layout of the colours is quite random and it's really truly scrappy. And then maybe you use that to make a stockinette sweater or some scrappy socks, or you know, something that you're going to lean into that scrappy element of. But we can also do something a little bit more curated with magic knot balls. So if you're just somebody like me who I'm not making a magic knot ball as I go, I just keep all of my scraps in bags based on sort of fibre content and the weight of the yarn, just things that would plausibly go together. So like all of my sock yarns are in the same bag, so that if I get the craving to do a scrappy sock, I know that everything in that bag is suitable for that. Or I've got DK weight acrylic yarn, so there are things that I might pick out if I'm making something for a child, for example. But that's the way I tend to organise my scraps, is just sort of let's group things together in a way that makes sense for if I was gonna make a project of a specific type, these are things that would all go together quite plausibly. And if you just keep on adding to those and adding to those and adding to those, eventually, especially if you're somebody who like understands what colours you like, if you've got quite specific tastes, you're probably going to naturally curate some colours that go together throughout that process. And then once you've got enough, you could make a magic knot ball where it's not completely random and it's not completely scrappy. You could make one that's sort of all different shades of green. If you really like green and you make a lot of projects that are green, you might end up with several small snippets of green yarn that you can then tie together into a magic knot ball. You could maybe even make it some sort of semi-regular. I'm going to attach it in 2-gram pieces. If I end up with a scrap that's 10 grams left over, I'm going to cut that into 5 different balls of 2 grams, and I'm going to intersperse that throughout my magic knot ball. And if you're going to do that, then you can really push the limits of what a magic knot ball does, because it essentially works similar to like a colour changing yarn if you're going to do something like that, or at least make it a little bit more cohesive and a bit less scrappy. And then I thought, if you were going to do that, you could basically just sub in that magic knot ball for any colour changing yarn. So I'm thinking things like the Framed by Andrew Marray. If you had a magic knot ball that you curated into specific colours, I mean, you wouldn't even need to keep to a specific colour story. You just need to make sure that it contrasts enough with whatever your main colour is. So I think, like, again, if you were going to make something like the Framed, or maybe the Pressed Flowers series by Amy Christophers, those sort of graphic 2-colour high contrast motifs, you could pick like a really quite standard main colour, like a black or a white or a grey, and then have loads of different colours tied into a magic knot ball. And I think you'd get enough contrast that you'd still see those motifs using that. And that'd be a really cool way to use up your magic knot ball and like curate your magic knot ball. And I really like this concept that you can make a project that's scrappy without it having to look scrappy. I do think if you're going to do the standard magic knot ball where it is just truly random, I think the way that you ground that is by having some sort of main colour alongside it. So maybe you're making a scrappy blanket, but you've got a border that's a consistent colour all around it. Or maybe you're making a scrappy jumper or a scrappy pair of socks, but the collar or the cuff or the toe, like the edgings, like the cuffs on the sleeves and the collar and the hem, are all one solid colour, and that just sort of ties it all together. Same with the sock, if the heel, toe and cuff is just a solid colour, and then you've got that scrappy sort of winding round lots of different colours effect, as long as it's grounded with a single solid colour, I think that can look quite good. So the next concept builds on this for me, and that is marling. So if you've got 2 different colours of yarn, hold them double and marl them together, and you get a little bit more mileage. So you might not have enough of that fingering weight yarn to make a hat, but if you held it with another fingering weight yarn, or with some mohair that you've got left over, or even something like heavier weight, like you can hold a fingering weight and a DK, and they don't necessarily need to be the same colour, and just see what that effect is, just to get enough yardage and enough of a weight of a yarn to make a different project. So if you're making something with fingering weight, you're going to need a lot more of that fingering weight yarn than you would need if you were making, say, a worsted pattern, holding it alongside a DK. So some specific patterns that recommend that you use marling would be the Bear Paw Socks, again by Andrew Marray, or something like, I think it's called the Monday Sweater from Petite Knit. I think everybody knows the one that I'm talking about, the one where she marls the colours together. But one thing I was thinking about with the marling is you could push that a little bit further, couldn't you? Because if you made a magic knot ball, then marl with your magic knot ball with a solid colour. So you could make like a plain stockinette sweater, but the colour is the excitement, because you've got maybe a white and then a load of different colours all marled together, so it mutes the whole thing down a little bit. I think the first time I've seen a concept like this is the Alone Together sweater, where it is marled, but I think the main colour of the sweater in her sample is a white, and then she's essentially made a magic knot ball where there's a lot of white in it, and then there's little strips of colour, and so it looks like almost like a watercolour effect across it, where you've got these like random little moments of colour dispersed throughout it. And I thought that was a really nice way. It actually looks really sophisticated for a scrappy project. I just think that grounding your scraps and just using a little bit of like a pop here and there just looks really effective. Again, maybe when you're making your magic knot ball, maybe you've got like 20 grams worth of scraps, and maybe you intersperse those alongside a full 50 gram skein of just a plain white or a plain grey or a plain black, just so that you've got those little moments of colour throughout that, and then hold it with something solid again. I just think that you could do so much with that, and you wouldn't just need to make a sweater. You could do a sweater or a hat or some socks or some mittens. basically any project that you can think of. Say I find a DK weight sweater and I really want to make it marled, I just need to hold 2 fingering weights together. That makes a DK, and then I can marl it. So whatever weight of sweater you're looking at, you just need to sort of figure out a yarn combination that would make that weight, not in a single strand, and then you can turn it into a marled pattern yourself. Another concept that I really like when it comes to using up little scrappy bits and little odds and ends is striping. So there's 2 patterns again that come to mind when we're thinking about sort of scrappy stripy sweaters. I think anybody that's tried to make a scrappy stripy sweater has heard of Stripe Height. Fantastic pattern. I think there's a similar one called the Scrappy Striped Sweater where the stripes on that are a little bit slimmer, and in the listing photos on Ravelry for the scrappy stripes, she's gone for this sort of like fade. I think she's used an advent calendar, and the stripes fade all the way down the sweater. So there's like one main colour and then that sort of interspersed with stripes that fade along the sweater. I just really like that. I like this concept of having one main colour and then having lots of random different bits of stripes in there with all of these scraps. And then for a crochet project, something like the granny stripe blanket, again, it's just like a simple striping pattern. And I also think when we think about stripes, my brain immediately goes to sort of regular stripes with some sort of predictable colour sequence. But that's not the only type of stripes that you can do. So when we think about things like the excavation blanket that's really popular for scraps, technically it's a striping sequence. It's a very scrappy striping sequence, but it's a striping sequence nonetheless. And if you lean into that, so I'm thinking about patterns like the Olymp vest. I'm not necessarily going to recommend that because it's not size inclusive, but you could take the concept that's in that project and apply it to basically anything. So the first combination that came into my head was the Midland cardigan by Laura Penrose. Is basically the Olymp vest, but it's a cardigan. You could take that concept of like that sideways construction and just use your scraps throughout the garter stitch. If you wanted to marl it to make it a little bit less in your face, you could do, but you could really think about the colour story of that. Again, I think as long as you put in those sort of details on to ground it, like using the same colour for the cuffs and the hem and the button band, I think that would ground it. So basically any pattern you can think of, like, I think it really works with that sideways construction. But if it's already got the stripe sequence put into it, or even if it's not, you could put your own sort of scrappy striping sequence into that pattern, and I think it's really effective as long as you use the sort of same colour for all of the finishings. And another pattern that uses this is the Easy Beanie Multicolour, I think it's called. And again, it's that sort of, if you're familiar with the Olymp vest, it's that sort of concept where it's got stitched sideways and you sort of striping through your different scraps, but it's a beanie. And then the final idea that I had for knitting and crochet, or more so knitting really at this point, for using your scraps and your random little oddballs of leftovers, was modular knitting. I think the classic modular crochet piece is anything using granny square. So you could have done something quite scrappy with this. I ended up making it really regular, but I've seen a lot of people make granny square vests and granny square jumpers where they are really scrappy, and then they just border them all in the same sort of neutral colour, again to ground them. But all of the different granny squares are really scrappy. I think the type of granny square projects that and I've spoken about this before, but the one that I'm really itching to cast on is the Imagination quilt. And I just think as long as you knew that you had enough yarn, that would be a really good scrappy one, because you just need to make sure that you've got lots of a main colour, and then all of the different contrast bits you could probably make in scraps. I'm not familiar enough with that pattern to know exactly how much of each one you need, but if you've got like random balls left over from certain projects, you might not be able to use true sort of, I've got 10 grams of this, 20 grams of this scraps. But if you've got, I made a whole sweater and I've got a full skein left over, you might be able to incorporate something like that into something like an Imagination quilt. And then again, I don't think you can talk about scrappy modular knitting without talking about Laura Penrose. She's got the Sweet Shop blanket, which took the internet by storm when that released, and then she's got the 2 Stella motifs, or the 2 Stella designs. There's a cushion cover and a blanket for that, and then I think there's also an expansion pack for the quilt where you can do all sorts of different quilt motifs. I think she's designed that so that the triangles in the Sweet Shop need 20 grams of yarn. So if you had fingering weight and you wanted to marl them, you just need 10 grams each of each colour. So that would be a really good one. Again, you'd need a main colour for all of those designs. And then going back to the crochet, the Scrappy Granny Pillow. And then another thought that I had was any sort of modular sweater. So there's a couple of patterns. Again, I don't really want to recommend them because neither of them are size inclusive, but there's the Kai Fella sweater, and then there's also, I think it's from like Wool and the Gang or somewhere like that, or what's the other one called? We Are Knitters. And they've got a free pattern on their website called the Watermelon Sweater. And basically these two, they're very similar concepts but executed quite differently, but they are, I think they work bottom up, and you just make strips of stripes. Just for argument's sake, let's say like 10 stitches across, and you maybe work 10 rows and then you change colours, and then maybe you work 20 rows and then you change colours, and you do maybe 5 rows, and you just sort of do a random striping sequence up, and then you use modular knitting to add another panel next to that, and so you end up with this sort of like irregular checkerboard effect. But I do think if you're a comfortable enough knitter and you'd made enough sweaters, you probably could figure something like this out with your own maths, where you just figure out how much of each scrap you've got and you could make a sweater sort of piecing it together that way. And again, it'd look quite scrappy, but I think if you put enough of the same sort of colours in, it could still look really pulled together. And then finally, I did just want to touch on the fact that just because it's yarn, like if your hobby is knitting or if your hobby is crochet and you don't have any overlap between those two crafts, that's fine. If you only knit, that's fine. If you only crochet, that's fine. But I wouldn't necessarily box yourself into that sort of maker identity when it comes to scraps. Just because you are a knitter or just because you are a crocheter doesn't mean that you have to use your leftover yarn for knitting or crochet. It might be a case of, if you've got, I mean, I take the scrap collecting to the extreme. I've got a little bag where I keep all of my ends, so like when I've finished weaving my ends in and I cut a little bit off, I've got a bag full of those and I chop them up into little pieces and I use those as toy stuffing. But you could also use them to stuff draft excluders or basically anything that needs stuffing, pillows, things like that. You could recycle those little bits of yarn. You don't necessarily need to knit them to use them up or crochet them to use them up. You could also use them for things like really small weaving projects or really small plaiting projects, basically anything that uses little bits of string. So you could use them to make little sort of friendship bracelets, or you could use them in kids art and crafts. So like I know that there's something where you dip yarn in paint and then you sort of squiggle it across the paper to make different sort of designs, or you can cover them in glue and sort of use them for model making. Scraps of yarn are really good for like kids crafts. And then if you are someone who happens to spin, I don't know on the logistics of this because I don't do it myself, I'm not a spinner, but I have heard that if you've got really small little bits of scraps, you can like cut them up and turn them back into fibre and then spin them back into new yarn. I think that would probably look similar to the Magic Knot Ball, but maybe you could use them to like tweed your yarn. Again, I'm not close enough to it, but maybe you could, when you're spinning them, put those little bits of scraps in to get little tweed flecks. Or you could just get a really random colour yarn for like mixing up all of your little scraps together and making a new strand out of those. So just, again, just a little bit of a thought, not necessarily any specific patterns or specific advice, but just a concept there of, just because you bought that material for a specific craft doesn't necessarily mean you need to use it for that specific craft. Just some closing thoughts there. So yeah, that's everything that I've got for you today. I'd really love to hear if you've got any ideas for how to use up scraps that I haven't thought about, but mainly what I'd really love to hear is if you watch this video and you've got some scraps and it's giving you an idea for something that you can do with those scraps that wasn't something that you'd previously thought about. So if you've got, you know, like 200 grams of DK weight scraps and you'd never thought, oh, I could make a Magic Knot Ball and then marl it with something and sort of ground it that way. Like, I'd love to hear about that. As I said at the beginning of the video, I do upload these every other Sunday at 9 AM UK time. So if you'd like to see more, I'd love it if you stick around and hit that subscribe button. Please like the video if you liked it, and I'd love to hear from you in the comment section. And other than that, I'll see you next time. Bye!